Zoom likes to change things up just to keep you on your feet. It's nice to see people coming in. Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very glad to be back with you all today for our June Book Talks. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure you're chatting to everyone. We love to know who's in the room with us. The chat box is also where you can add your questions, and we'll try to bring them in later in our conversation. A few words about JWA for anyone who's new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So I thank you for being our partners in this work. The book talks are just one small part of JWA's work, so I hope that you will check out jwa.org and get a better sense of the full range of projects and resources that we offer. On a very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click the button at the bottom of your screen that, at least it used to say show caption. Does it still say that? Yes, it says CC show captions. That should turn it on for you, and hopefully that will work. Okay, I'm delighted to introduce our featured author for this evening. Rebecca Clarren is an award-winning journalist who's been writing about the American West for 25 years. Her journalism, for which she has won the Hillman Prize, a Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Grant, and 10 grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism, appears in such magazines as High Country News, The Nation, and Indian Country Today. Her debut novel, Kicked Down, was shortlisted for the Penn Bellwether Prize, and her latest book, a work of memoir, history, and reporting, which we'll be discussing tonight, which is wonderful, The Cost of Free Land, Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance, was named a Best Book of 2023 by Kirkus Reviews, the Tribal College Journal, the Jewish Forward, and the Christian Science Monitor, and was shortlisted for the Great Plains Book Award and Stanford Soroyan Prize. And was there another one that you told me about, Rebecca, that I'm not including?
The High Plains Book Award was just announced this week.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
And Rebecca joins us from Portland, Oregon, where she lives with her husband and 2 kids. Welcome, Rebecca. So glad to have you with us tonight.
It's wonderful to be here, and it's so fun to see where all of you are coming in from all over the country. I'm so glad to be sharing this virtual space tonight.
We have a great community of people who come together, and it's such an honor to bring people together to talk about important work like yours. So I wanted to start actually with a line from the end of your book that really struck me. It's actually a question, and it's a question that struck me because it's very much at the heart of the work of the Jewish Women's Archive, which was created to center the untold stories of Jewish women. And the line is, what are the stories we tell, and what are the stories we don't tell, and why? It's a simple question, but a very powerful one. So I want to ask you how you came to tell this particular story or entangled stories.
Great question, and thank you. Yeah, I love that you picked up on that, because to me that is so much at the heart of really what drives all of my work, but particularly this book, that I'm researching not just what has been written, not what is just told, but what's the white space at the edges of the telling? What do we leave off the page? And so for me, when it came to my own family, my ancestors were Jewish homesteaders on the South Dakota prairie, and I grew up with these amazing stories about their life in their very difficult life they had in South Dakota. There were these, what I think of as like our greatest hits. There are stories like my Uncle Louis, who could stand on the back of a horse, and another cousin who could clear, the family lore is that he would like clear a path of rattlesnakes every morning between the house and the outhouse when he was 5. And our favorite story, the one that weirdly the women in my family particularly love, is about, I think it's weird because of the story I'm about to say, which is my great-great-grandmother, Fagetka. She would ask her daughters in the middle of winter to go outside and crack the ice of the creek that ran behind their house, and then she would dunk naked in that freezing water. This was her mikvah that she was doing on the frozen prairie. And all the women in my family call that a cute story. But I thought a lot, and I grew up just so enamored with these stories. In fact, I named my youngest kid Louis because I loved the stories about my Uncle Louis. And it took me a long time, I've come to feel an embarrassingly long time of reporting in the American West. I've been a journalist in this region for 25 years. And over that time, I've written, repeatedly about Native nations and communities. And it just took a long time for me of interviewing elders and sitting with the truth of their version of the American story for me to start to make a connection, to see, as a journalist, I wasn't this unbiased outsider to the history and the reporting I was doing about, which was often about the legacy of federal policy of 20th century of land dispossession of Native people. That wasn't a story that was like a quote unquote societal issue, that it was my story too, because since my family were homesteaders, we benefited from the taking of Native land, because that Native land was immediately turned and given for free to mostly white people, or white enough people like my ancestors were. And so I guess that's what started to make me, those realizations, those conversations made me start to think, what's more here? What are the more of the stories we're not telling? And that third piece, why aren't we telling them, both in families and in nations? Because of course, the myth of ourselves that we want to pass on to future generations, it's both, it's as much what we tell as what we don't.
Right. Well, and there's so much to learn from this. I learned a lot from your story. I think I said this to you before, I have a PhD in American history, and I learned a lot from your story, from your book. So I appreciate that. And I think even just on the Jewish kind of thread of the story, um, for those of us who are from the Northeast and whose families came through that sort of more traditional narrative of, settling in urban centers in the Northeast, there's a lot to learn from the Jewish piece too. So tell us a little bit about what brought your family to the US and how they became homesteaders and what that meant to them.
So my family, like so many of those of us who are Ashkenazi, my family was living in the Pale of Settlement in the part of Russia where Jews were allowed to live. My great-great-grandfather, Harry, was in a terrible pogrom in 1881 and was beaten to within an inch of his life. The home that he lived in with his dad and his uncle were set fire to, and so he left where he was living, which was in Odessa, and he came back to recover in Kapulia, which is in what is today Belarus. And he, long story short, he meets my great-grandmother, and they have 6 children, and their lives were hard. I get into this in the book, because to me, it was just, I didn't want to just start with South Dakota. I wanted to give all of the stories I was trying to tell a lot of context and nuance. So it was important to me to ground and to help understand what brought my family to America. And part of what brought them here was the fact that it was very dangerous, that Jews could not own land, as many of you know. They couldn't own land in where they lived in the Pale. My great-great-grandfather was a smith, but he couldn't work with gold or silver. Jews weren't allowed to be in those guilds, so their economic potential was diminished. Jewish young boys were often conscripted into the Russian army and forced to convert. And there was always a fear. My great aunt Etta, who is still alive, is 91. She has a great interest in history. For anyone who reads the book, they'll come to know her. I write about her a lot. And she interviewed in the 70s, she interviewed a bunch of relatives who had been children in the Pale. And one of them said, we were always scared. We were always scared that we would be raped by the soldiers who were coming through, or that we would be kidnapped. So for all those factors, my family joins the thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews that are fleeing Eastern Europe and coming to America. But my family,
ultimately.
Yeah, right, exactly. And ultimately, but my family, unlike so many of us, didn't stay in New York. They took the train, and they took it as far as they could go at the time, and that was Sioux City, Iowa. And there were so many other Jews from that part of Kapulia, from Kapulia, the shtetl where they had come from, living in Sioux City. There was a synagogue called the Anshe Kapulia Synagogue when they got there. And at some point they hear about this free land. And so my great-grandmother and her 2 siblings that were closest in age to her, and my great-great-grandmother, the reason they finally come to America and join the rest of the family is because Harry had gotten in on this free land, And
I'm pulling up
this
the images because they're so fabulous to see.
and this free land is part, based on what I can gather from family documents and a letter I found from a bank, it looks like the $900 mortgage that Harry takes out on his free land pays for passage for Fagetka and her three youngest children, among them my great grandmother. This poster, which is all of the images we're going to show you tonight, come from the book. This is something from the Library of Congress. And I don't know exactly how Harry found out about the free land on offer, but we have a family story that he wrote to his wife in Russia, and she said, you know, you have health problems, you should do it. You know, I think they thought it would be like some sort of dacha. They had no idea what they were getting into. And this poster is different from the one Harry might have seen because it says Indian land for sale. And the land my family got in on was actually free and had until very recently been reserved for Lakota use in perpetuity by a federal treaty.
And as you already said, land was desirable to them because that was something that was out of reach for Jews in Eastern Europe. And so the idea of being able to own land was very exciting. And you know, their ability to take advantage of that land was not some of the anti-Semitic feelings of the time in the cities when all these Eastern Europeans were arriving helped it's probably how they found out about it, because there were a lot of people in the cities who were eager to move these new immigrants along to other places. So that also kind of
Yes, exactly. It's so fascinating. There were these many German immigrants who had come like 30, 40 years earlier to America are doing their darndest to just blend in. They go to synagogue on Sundays. They're trying to do well in business. They're dropping their accents. And then all of these Russian Jews show up and all of this anti-Semitism is happening. And so it's such a fascinating history that these German businessmen get together and they decide, we're going to get these Jews out of the cities, out of the East Coast, get them onto farms and give them loans, give them agricultural training. There was even a Yiddish language newspaper called the Yiddish Farmer that had something like, I'm not going to say it right, but maybe 12,000 subscribers in like 1913. And my family didn't, as far as I can tell, get in on any of the loans or supports, but there were in the early 1900s, there were something like 30,000 Jewish farmers in America.
right.
Yeah. Many of them getting in on these free homesteads. In the Dakotas, there were about 1,000 Jewish homesteaders. And I think it's important to note that was only about half of 1% of all homesteaders. But it's still significant that there were 1,000 families that were homesteading.
For sure. And I think it's significant certainly in terms of understanding your own story. And
yes, and for my ancestors, should we show them the next slide?
Yeah.
So this is like one of my favorite pictures. The man with the amazing tall boots, that's my great-grandfather, Jake Cosberg. All three of so Harry and Pega Etka, they have 6 children. All 3 of their daughters marry Jewish homesteaders. This area of South Dakota wasn't just my family. They went with about 70, there were about 70 Jews in all, that locals to this day refer to this area as Jew Flats, although a Jew has not lived there for a very long time. And one of these men is my Uncle Ted. This is his claim shack. You can see this is not glamorous living. These were like 10 by 12 shacks. I was very pleased to learn the reason why all the claim shacks were 10 by 12 is because that's how much of a load of wood you could carry in the back of your wagon. These were for the most part, treeless plains. And so you had to bring the wood in. You weren't going to, like Little House on the Prairie style, cut down the logs and build your cabin. For my family, they told their children that the land made them feel more American. My great-grandmother and her sister Rose, they called this the good earth. Deborah Shine, who's a historian, has done some work on this. And she said, even the Jewish immigrants that failed at the homesteading experiment and who left the prairie or left their land, for them, it allowed them the time to kind of metabolize what it meant to be American, to shake off their suspect immigrant status. And if we go to the next picture, you can see, they just, oh, this one's amazing. Like, how did they keep those clothes so white? That's Svegatka of the mikveh on the right side, and her oldest daughter, Fanny, and an assortment of children. And you can see in the back this sod structure. When they first moved to the prairie, they lived in a sod house, a house made of bricks of wood. It was really terrible, apparently. And but you can see here they are, they have cows, they're doing well. And they had so much more freedom. Here they are, they're going to school. This picture is a school photo. You can see Uncle Louis on the very far right side, and my great grandmother, Ruth S., there she is on the left, whereas I see it on the left. But these are Jewish and non-Jewish people all going to school together, boys and girls going to school together. Like, back in the Pale of Settlement, none of that was happening. So this was an incredible opportunity for them. And at the same time, it had real economic impact. So I've done a lot of investigative reporting, and I was sitting on this trove of family stories, but I wanted to find something resembling a fact. And so I actually pulled every deed that my family owned. By the 1950s, the land, we had about a 6,000 acre cattle ranch. And I also then pulled every mortgage on those taken out on that land. And what I found was this pattern where over and over again, my family would take out a relatively small amount of money based on the value of their land, but it would give them this sort of pathway to the middle class and beyond. It allowed them to move. It allowed them to buy more land, start other businesses. My family gets really into saloon ownership in the Black Hills for a time. And I added up all of those relatively small amounts of money and adjusted for inflation. And what I found was that in today's dollars, those mortgages total $1.1 million. So not even talking about how much they sell the land for. My grandmother and her two sisters sold the last bit of Jew flats in 1970. But and the economists that I interviewed said, this is American capitalism. It wasn't just Jews doing this on the prairie. Everyone was doing this. And this was the way to get ahead. But this was something that Native people were not getting in on at all or doing with their land. And so you start to see this incredible way that the system is privileging my ancestors at cost to their Native American neighbors.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to stop for a moment so we can talk a little bit more, and then we'll show some more of those photos. But so let's turn to that question of what was happening to their Lakota neighbors at the same time. Your family had this really, amazing opportunity to get this free land and then to be able to leverage it in all kinds of ways. From the moment of arriving to, expanding into other businesses and other opportunities and bringing over lots of relatives. But what is the cost to their neighbors, and what's the story of how this opportunity even opened to them?
So I think it's important to say that of all the stories that I was told about my family on the prairie, none of them were about their relationship with their Lakota neighbors. The closest reservation was only 13 miles away. So I had a lot of questions about why didn't, in all the letters, my family doesn't throw anything away. It's like a disease. We don't do that. It's also
so good for your book. I kept thinking in your book, oh my gosh, wow, amazing resources. You didn't have to go far to find these incredible sources.
Yeah. I have a line in my book that I really feel strongly. It's like the line between historian and pack rat is very paper thin. Like but it is. I am the same way. I have boxes in my attic of school programs from 1985. So the thing about how this happened, and I wondered a lot, what did my family understand about how this land became available? And I don't know, because they didn't mention it in their record or the stories they passed down. But what I know, and what we know today, is that in the 1850s, California becomes a state, has this amazing amount of natural resources, and there is an interest from both the railroads and the United States government to connect California with the rest of the country. But the railroads know that the cost of putting that line across and the cost of hauling, that long haul hauling, will not cover the cost of of maintaining and building a rail line. And what they need are lots of little communities along the railroad line, which will support, just by being there, by bringing in their dry goods, shipping out their cattle, the cost of the railroad. Inconveniently for the railroads and for the United States government, around the exact same time, the United States has signed a treaty, which is the highest law of the land, with a number of native nations of the Great Plains, promising that great swaths of the Dakotas and beyond would be in native land. It would be reserved in native use for perpetuity. I use that language clearly because my Lakota friends have said we didn't own the land. That wasn't something we thought of. We lived with the land. We would never own our mother, which is how we think of the earth. So, but promises made become promises broken. And so between 1851, when this first treaty is signed between the United States and the Lakota Nation, and 1908, when my family are planting their first crops on the South Dakota Prairie, based on my research, and I had help from a geographer at Haskell University, we've dug into the treaties. The treaties were written in like descriptive language, like it's from the mountains to the river, not acreage. But based on our research, we think that by the time my family are planting those first crops, the Lakota are living on just 2% of the land that they had reserved would be theirs forever in 1851. And there was a series of break-in promises. Also during that time, Lakota culture, religion, and traditions and economy is very traditionally tied up in the buffalo, the American buffalo. And at the time of 1851, there were millions and millions of buffalo on the prairie. The United States sets out, but that's very inconvenient for a railroad if like huge herds of bison are going through that land. And so, and the United States wanted to control native nations. So for both reasons, they set out to try and make the bison extinct. And this is a photograph from the 1890s. Those are buffalo skulls. And you can see by the size of the men in that photograph that goes almost 2 stories high. By the 1890s, there were less than 500 buffalo left on the prairie in America. I'm happy to report today, thanks in large part to Indigenous efforts, the buffalo are rebounding. And there are more than 80 Indigenous nations who have thriving herds of buffalo under their management. But at the time, when we're talking about the costs, this was one of the costs. And, you know, at no point are my relatives asked to change their last name, to braid their last challah, to stop speaking Yiddish. But that is basically exactly what is being asked of their Lakota neighbors. Suddenly Lakota religion is illegal. There's all these efforts, policies and laws by the United States to try and attempt to divorce Native American connection to land so that it would be easier to take more land. And so to do that, the United States, you know, makes it illegal to have Lakota Native religion. The language becomes illegal to use. And I mean, to me, one of the worst, if not the worst thing that was done was children were taken from their families and sent to federal boarding schools run mainly by Christian nuns or priests or by the military as an effort to assimilate Native people. This was, they sold it to the public as like, this is good for Indians, right. But it was terrible for most people.
And it was interesting to think about the parallel of one of the, you know, what historians call push factors of immigration of Jews from Russia was the forced conscription of young boys, you know, who were taken at 12 years, but often much younger for these 25-year military service. And that was just such a devastating thing for the Jewish community. And it was done for the exact same kind of reason of feeling like if you take kids away young, then they lose their tradition and heritage and family. And to think of that as being something that pushed a lot of Jews to immigrate to the US. And then there is something similar going on that is not visible as similar. The same way that you point out in the book that the restriction of Native people to reservations isn't totally dissimilar from the restriction of Jews to the Pale of Settlement. It's a similar kind of thing. You can't own this land, but you have to live in this place, and there are very particular laws about what you can do and where you can go. But it's not an analogy that was probably accessible to your relatives.
You know, I thought a ton about what were they noticing? What were they seeing? What does it mean to have survived oppression to then become part of an oppressive system? And I was very lucky because I didn't have to figure everything out on my own. And I had a lot of both Jewish rabbis and elders and Native elders who were helping me think through a lot of this. And one of them who is very important to me is Judge Abby Abenanti. She's Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation in California. And I had met her, I was writing a profile about her for The Nation magazine. And she said to me at one point, everyone knew what was happening to Indians. But in the next, this is very Judge, she's very compassionate. And in the next breath, she said, but when you're running for your life in terror, which is what your family was doing when they came to this country, you're not stopping to have a quick restorative justice conversation along the way. She said, you know, it's going to take several generations of not growing up with what we would today call trauma, which is the trauma of being raised by people who were traumatized, to step towards this history. She said, you are lucky. You didn't have to grow up in a traumatized household. So it makes sense that you and your cousins and brother are the ones starting to face this now. And I think there's something very sad and very hopeful about that idea.
It's a very generous reading, certainly, and helpful because it's a compassionate reading. And I think so often that's like, you need to enter into these conversations about repair with that lens of being compassionate, you know, understanding the harm that was done, but also being compassionate to people who didn't understand it at the time, and figuring out how do we then have empathy now ourselves, without, you know.
No, I thought,
how do we harness that that impulse?
I think it's so easy to judge the dead. It's so easy to say, oh, if I was alive, I would have been so upset. If I would have been during the Underground Railroad, I would have been hiding people in my basement. And yet the more I learned, and as I write about in the book, the really racist messaging that was being stuffed into my family's head, and that they would have, with their own fear and trauma, been receptive to swallow, probably. I don't know that I would have been any different if I was in their circumstances, you know.
So one of the other things that you write about that Judge Abby told you that was so important to your process was about, if you were interested in thinking about repair and harm, to turn to your own tradition to understand Jewish culture's insights about that. So tell us, which you did. So tell us a little bit about that process and how that wove into this project.
Yeah, exactly. I came to her early on and said, what do you think? I want to write this entangled history, because so often, if we are taught this history at all, which most of, you know, the history of Native America, the history of Jewish immigrants or immigrants as well, we're taught them in silos. We aren't taught them at the same time in this entangled way that I intend to do in my book. And I wanted to do that because I feel like you miss the depth of the injustice of federal policy unless you tell them side by side. You really don't see as well how the United States clearly picked certain groups to benefit and others to be harmed by the same policy. And Judge said to me, yeah, that sounds good, but you should really, if you're going to do that, you should respond to it. How are you going to take action? And she said, the best thing for you would be to do that. This kind of thing works best. Justice works best when it's done through the lens of your own culture. And she said, so what do the Jews say about how to respond to a harm, even one you didn't directly commit, but one you benefited from? And I was really fortunate because my rabbi here in Portland, his name is Benjamin Barnett, and he immediately saw the benefit that this kind of course of study of looking at to atonement and repentance and repair specifically around this question of native land dispossession, that this would be learning that could benefit our whole community. And so he and I started to meet, and we, over a course of like, I think 3 years, we did regular Havruta study in pairs, and we read the Torah and the Talmud for places where there's discussion about how you respond to harm. And we also studied the contemporary sermons of rabbis today who are using these teachings for us to grapple with the past. And there were so much that I learned that doesn't end up in the book, but the stuff that is in, I do end up threading throughout the book, the Jewish learning that helped me come to make sense with my position and place in this history.
Mm-hmm. It was really beautiful to read about, and also to read about how you then taught, you and the rabbi did a class together for your own community, and sort of, you know, what people's response was like, and how you were able to bring people into that process that you had gone through.
Yeah, it was really special. We did this class just almost as like a focus group. I wasn't done writing the book, and it really helped me to understand where I needed to explain more fully how certain Jewish teachings, Rabbi Benjamin mostly was teaching the Jewish teachings, and I was giving the historical context, but we helped people in the class do their own research. And Rabbi Benjamin just kept saying, how do you find yourself in this story? Mm-hmm. There's this wonderful Jewish teaching that I love out of Deuteronomy about if there's a murdered person in the road, what do you do? If you find this corpse and you don't know who did the murdering, what are the communities supposed to do? And this is pre-Israelite days that Deuteronomy is discussing. And the idea was that the communities closest to the corpse would measure their distance to this body, and whatever community was closer would take responsibility for burying the body, but also doing a ritual to kind of purify the entire community, which had great economic impact to that community. It involves killing like a heifer, I think. And there's a bunch of other things they did. And Toba Spitzer, this wonderful rabbi out of Massachusetts, she said, you know,
she's right down the street.
Oh, she is. She's so fantastic.
Yeah.
She has a wonderful sermon about this teaching. And she says, you know, America has twin original sins, which is the enslaving of humans and the stealing of land from Native Americans. And she says, how do we all find ourselves in this history? How do we measure our distance from these original crimes? And I thought about that so much because, you know, there is research that shows that 25% of American adults living today descend from homesteaders. That's almost 90 million, more than 90 million people potentially. And very, very few of us are people of color. And so my distance and the others of us who are descendant of homesteaders, it's important to note that sociologists say that those of us who descend from homesteading, if we have wealth that we accrued intergenerationally, that is because of homesteading, because it was like the biggest affirmative action for white people that America had ever created. But all of us living in America today have benefited from the breaking of treaties and the taking of native land. And it's the foundation of our highway systems and so many of our cities. And so how do we all start to find ourselves, measure our own distance, even if maybe, you know, if you arrived here if your family came on slave ships, if your family arrived last week, you know, your distance is going to be different than mine. But I think we all can start to consider that. I hope we do.
Yeah, and you point out some of the ways that we might not think of, you know, having attended a land grant university, which is cheaper because of where it's located and because the land was free and, you know, was taken illegally, and where we get our power from, and does it come from, you know, dams and other things that Native people bore the brunt of. And so just being creative in that way. And I think that's been one of the real learnings over the last few years, is trying to understand, especially for white people, complicity and harm that we might want to, in terms of that measuring process, might want to say, oh, we're far apart from that it's part of American history, but it's not my history, right? And so how do we take ownership of things? And one of the ways also that I think that helped you through that process, and also both taking ownership and learning a lot, was through building relationships with Lakota people and really coming to hear their perspective and understand, build those relationships in the moment and also see how your stories were connected
Yeah.
potentially in the past as well. So tell us a little bit about Doug Whitebull, who's one of the people that appears
Yeah.
as an incredible character in your book.
So do you want to show the photo or should I just
Yeah,
describe?
let me show the photo and then I want you also to read a little piece of that section. So
Okay.
hold on a
Would love
second
to.
here.
So
Um,
even though there were no stories about my family, I think you got to go back.
oh,
No, there were no stories about my family and their Lakota neighbors. There were these mysterious photographs like this one. There's Uncle Louie again, and he's standing with these men dressed in native regalia. I have learned this is Dakota beadwork. And if
hmm.
you go to the next photograph, here's a photo of my Uncle Jack. This is my great grandmother's older brother and my grandmother's beloved uncle. And here, this is such a weird, rare photograph. You don't see, I've done so much historical research to try and solve the mystery of why these two men took this photograph. But what I did learn on one of my very first trips to the Dakotas when I was starting work on this book about 5 years ago, tribal historians at about 3 different reservations near where my family lived, they said, we think this is Joseph Whitebull in this photograph. And Joseph Whitebull was a really big deal of his era. He was the nephew of Sitting Bull. He was chief of the Minikoju Lakota. And the whole book was written about him in the 30s. And so because of the reporting I had done, I had people who trusted me, I guess is a way to put it. And one of them said, oh, I used to be married into the Whitebull family. Let me introduce you. And I came to know, and if you go to the next few slides, Doug Whitebull, this is a photo of Doug as a child and growing up on Standing Rock. And this next picture, this is a photo it's about 10 years old at this point, but this is him standing on the land where he and his family grew up. And Doug is still alive. He's in his 80s, he's retired, but it is a very beloved and respected coach and teacher in Lakota country. And there's even a Doug Whitebull Day in the state of South Dakota to honor his contributions to their community. And he was so thrilled, honestly, because he said, I wanted this story to come out. And we spent hours and hours and hours talking, me mostly listening to him share about his family story. And I'm going to read to you a little bit about from the moment when Doug and I went back and visited the land where he grew up. It's important for you to know that even though I said earlier, by the time my family shows up on the prairie, 1908, the Lakota are living on just 2% probably of the land that that they had reserved would be theirs forever. It's not like at that point the United States stops trying to take the land. Like that effort has been ongoing. And when Doug was a child in the 50s, the United States sets a series of dams on the Missouri River that was done for flood control of cities down south. But the vast majority of flooding from those dams flooded Lakota communities or native communities, and not just Lakota, and hundreds and hundreds of people had to move far away from what had been the richest, best land remaining on their reservation. Thanks for listening. One day, Doug, myself, and one of Doug's former students, Jeff McLaughlin, drive out to visit what's left of the place where Doug grew up on the edge of the Missouri River. There aren't any roads to get there. Up and down over buttes, we off-road in an old minivan that Jeff calls his Buck. It's a truck and a van, get it? He asks me with a quick, shy smile. Jeff, like many former students, calls Doug Lakshi, Lakota for uncle. As we near the cut bank far above the deep blue water, red chokecherries and wild plum cluster in the folds and creases of the land. When we reach the grassy slope where Doug used to run barefoot with his sisters, I ask him how it feels. Feels great. Feels like home, he says, closing his eyes under the bright sun. Swallows swoop through the sky. The air is filled with birdsong and the buzz of insects, the river and the wind. But for the moment, I'm not noticing any of that. I'm distracted by our effort to touch the past. An old cemetery, fenced off and thick with chokecherry, has survived the flood. While it had been slated for removal, the water never got that high, and the feds, by neglect or delay, left it alone. Deep inside the thicket of wild plants are gravestones of Doug's relatives, and he is determined to visit. Getting there will require this blind old man who relies on his cane as if it were a third limb to do the equivalent of bushwhacking. I explained to Doug where to put his foot and how to hold onto my arm and Jeff's arm. I'm embarrassed to share this part, but it's what happened. On the audio file, you can hear my voice asking if this is a good idea, cautioning Doug to be careful. Jeff quietly helps Doug step over the wire fence, gets a camp chair out of the van, and sets it up in the shade in case Doug needs a break. I should have known better. By this point, I knew a lot of Doug's stories, especially his greatest hits, such as the time he, as a teenager, ran a 50-mile race, finishing with bloody feet. I knew about his time at boarding school, a place he sometimes calls a concentration camp, where he was repeatedly hit and kicked by his teachers, sometimes with a wooden board across his bottom, for the crime of not making his bed correctly. I knew he'd survived all that and become a straight A student anyway. Not a person given to giving up, Doug slowly but steadily traverses the weedy expanse from the van to the graves deep in the middle of the cemetery. He never slows down, never complains. Standing as close as we can get to the old stones, the words in the marble etched in Lakota, I read the inscription aloud to Doug, and he translates. Here was Mary Whitebull, who died May 18th, 1902, at the age of 4. The shade of the chokecherry makes patches across our faces. As Doug takes a moment to contemplate the graves, I'm struck again by the weight of his loss, of what has been taken from him and his family to ensure a specific brand of American progress. There's a debate described in the Talmud between two rabbis over what should be done if it's discovered that a house or even a palace was built using a stolen beam as part of its foundation. One rabbi says the entire building must be demolished so that the beam can be returned to its original owners. The other rabbi, the far more pragmatic, says the building can remain standing if the full value of the beam is repaid. Both rabbis, though, make clear that as soon as it is known that the beam was stolen, those living in the house must do something. They must make amends. Our country was built on a stolen beam, Rabbi Sharon Brous of Los Angeles famously said in a 2017 sermon. To ignore this history and the legacy of this history diminishes the legitimacy and the power of this house, of this nation. The money that has come to the Lakota was arguably never a fair trade for what was taken, rarely a deal negotiated without some degree of coercion. And the losses compound one another. The flooding of Doug's childhood home, built on the takings of his father's land, his grandfather's land before that. And what of everything else that was stolen? The years Doug spent in fear at boarding school, the state-mandated destruction of Lakota language, religion, and culture. What payment can be made to replace such a loss? Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit about how you have come to answer that question of how to step towards repair, and what that looks like for you.
I love that you said for me, because I think it is this is a personal thing to consider at this point, because we are doing this, those of us who are considering our proximity to this history, in a vacuum of federal leadership. At this point, there's really not a single politician that working at the national level who I could point to, who I could say is working on the questions of how to repair this legacy of federal policy when it comes to Native Americans. But that said, there are a lot of efforts happening throughout the country at the local level that are trying to do this, and they're happening in all sorts of ways. And I mentioned them in the book, and I also have for anyone who's interested in sort of finding themselves in this history and stepping into it and learning more and maybe taking some action, I have resources for further research in the back of my book, and they're also available for free on my website.
And we'll link to that at the end.
Oh, good. I think that one thing, there's this incredible organization called the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And for 30 years, they're a Native-led organization, and they have been helping Native nations recover some of the land that they have lost. And the president of that organization, Chris Stainbrook, who is Lakota, he says, you know, when people donate to our work, it's a chance for people to help to live their values. Lakota people have said over and over again, we don't want money for the Black Hills, which is a part of what the land that was taken by the federal government. And even the United States Supreme Court ruled to say this was theft and we have to give you money for this. And the Lakota said, the Lakota, among whom are some of the very poorest people in America, 4 of the 10 counties in the country that are the poorest, according to the most recent census, are Lakota communities. And yet the Lakota have said resoundingly, we don't want your money. We want our land back. This for them, the Black Hills is their spiritual home. They call it the Heisapa. And so for me, after many, many years of study and many conversations with Lakota elders who started to talk to me about what would be a good thing for me and my family to do, Doug Whitebull said, he didn't tell me what to do. That's really not his way, but he reminded me of the ongoing efforts that when private land comes up for sale in the Black Hills, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation has been buying that up and holding it in trust for all Lakota people to use for ritual and ceremony. And so my family and I have created a fund called the Heisapa Land Recovery Fund at the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And I set our fundraising goal for $1.1 million, which is the amount that we received on the free land, those mortgages amount. And it's to just support those efforts to buy land in the Black Hills. And it's been really incredible. A lot of people in my family have donated, and then so many readers have been donating. And I've been really, and still I'm just so moved by that. But this was just one idea, you know, it's not the only way. And there are many others. What I love what I love, there's so much I would say, but 2 things. To me, a huge piece of this and a huge piece of what Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher of the 16th century, says is a way to repair. You know, he says, first, you have to stop doing the harm. Secondly, say the truth out loud. And to me, this book was an effort to tell my version of this truth out loud. And Les Ducheneau, who is a Lakota elder on the Cheyenne River Reservation, he lives on Cheyenne River, he said, you know, I want this history to be taught. I want that, so important. And Faith Spotted Eagle, who's a Dakota or Nakota elder, she says, when Native and non-Native people study the history of our country and the history of Native land dispossession together, for the Indigenous people, it is healing. For the non-Native people, it's freedom from denial. And I love that freedom from denial. I see its power in my own family, in my own unique way, that like by telling through this book, I tell some less savory stories about my ancestors, and found so many letters that, as one cousin described, they were very humanizing. And, you know, to come out of freedom from denial, freedom from the mythic stories that we've been told, there is grief that comes with that. There is true grief that I have experienced about knowing my ancestors for the bigger picture. But there's also this real freedom and compassion that I've seen within my family, of this sense like we don't have to, it's not like they were good and we're bad. We have this better sense like, this is just humans. Humans make mistakes. We are living today with lots of Michigas in our own family, and we can know this is how it is and how we move forward. So
and so much of the research about the power of sharing family narrative done by people like Marshall Duke which is something we talk about a lot at JWA, is actually the strongest is to tell stories that are the real stories that show the hard times and the not perfect times, as well as the good times and the, stories that are kind of more sparkly. Because as you're saying, they're more real and they reflect our own experience better. And they also teach us that like things don't have to be perfect, but you can still survive, right? But I want to actually ask that question about what it was like writing about your family story, especially when you are telling the real story, including a whole chapter about bootlegging, about the Shonda that your family doesn't want to talk about, and you have this story of Etta saying, like, asking you not to write about that piece. So how did you kind of come to manage that for yourself?
It was hard. Don't do it. Just kidding. Um,
Yes,
no,
historians prefer to write about dead people for a reason.
it's one of the most incredible experiences, honestly. It was really important to me to tell the truth. And it was also, I wanted to hold my family through that experience of truth telling. And yes, as you mentioned, there's this moment I describe on the page of my Aunt Etta saying, don't write about this. And obviously I end up writing about it, but I explain kind of why. And I guess the thing I would say I've learned is that, to me, it's not like I wrote every single bad story. There are plenty of secrets that I didn't tell, but the ones that were central to this book, which there's a whole thread about anti-Semitism in America. And so, for example, my family become bootleggers, but I again tried to really deeply contextualize and nuance. That was very shameful to my Aunt Etta's generation and older, although my cousins and I all think it's kind of cool that they did that. But they were very ashamed. But to me, it was because Jews couldn't get good jobs. That's on the page too. And so I did a lot of listening. I tried to really listen. Journalists are often told, like, don't let anyone see anything before it goes to press. But I followed the guidance of Mary Carr, who has written about her own family a lot. If anyone's looking to write a memoir about family, I really recommend The Art of Memoir. And she says, when the book is pretty far along, but before it goes to press, bring a copy. And it's nice if you come in person to the people that you're writing about. And so I did. I actually brought my very adorable younger child and a copy of the manuscript to Minnesota, and I gave it to family members. And I let anyone who was interviewed in the book on the Lakota side. For Doug, who's gone blind during this time, I actually read the entire book aloud to him over a 2-week period because I wanted him to be able to make sure I was getting it right. And there's ways I describe him in unflattering ways, and he never said a single thing. I think there's a good news end note to this challenging experience that you won't get if you read the book, which is my Aunt Etta got a copy of the finished book. The book came out October 3rd, but in September she got an early copy, and it was a couple days before Yom Kippur, and she called and she said, or she wrote me an email. She said, I have to tell you, reading this book was very hard and sad for me in places, but I am very proud of you. And oh, sorry. I love you, and thank you for helping me be more of a realist at the age of 90. She's 90. And I just felt like, God, if she can get there, there's some hope for the rest of us. So.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And it's a testament, I think, all the trust that people had in you is a testament to the way you did this in a relational way. And as you're saying, it speaks to actually the capacity and resilience of humans to grow and learn and be open. And God, we need so much more of that now. So thank you for providing us with a little bit of that kind of hope. We don't have too many questions. So if other people have questions they want to ask, please put them in there. We have a couple more minutes, but someone is asking for you to repeat the name of your family fund at the Indian Land Tenure Trust.
I'd love to. It's called the Hay Sapa Land Recovery Fund. And if you go to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation donations page, there's like a pick your purpose, and you scroll down to the very bottom and it's there.
Great.
And that's so kind that you wanted to know. Thank you for asking.
What were some of the biggest, obviously there was a lot you learned from this and there were a lot of things that were not known to you before, but were there particular things that were like the biggest surprises? And I'm sorry if you can hear the crazy rain that is coming right now, but hopefully breaking the insane heat that's been going on.
I'm so glad. That's wonderful. I can't hear it. There were so many things that I learned, that I had these moments, that is what I love about being a journalist. These moments where you're like, this is so crazy, and I can't believe that I didn't know this, and I want everyone to know. I mean, to me, the biggest thing that I learned was the way that Hitler was inspired to treat the Jews in Europe based on the way the United States had treated Native people. I never knew that. I was obsessed with the Holocaust growing up. I was like a kid who read aloud in dramatic fashion from Anne Frank to my, assembled younger relatives. And yet I never knew until Doug Whitebill told me this about Hitler. And then, of course, I did my own research and I read there's wonderful books. There's a great book called Hitler's American Model by James Whitman, who's a historian out of Yale. Isabel Wilkerson talks about this in her book Cast, which is so wonderful. But there are so many examples, and I describe them in the book, of all the various ways that Hitler sort of got this blueprint for diminishing the rights and the safety and the personhood of Jews from what America did. And that to me was a stunning thing. And it's been really interesting. I've done a lot of events, and this is not news in any of the Indigenous spaces that I have been in. And it is news for many non-Indigenous people.
Yeah, it is so interesting sort of what the specific lens and angle that each people has on its own experience. And I think, again, it's a reminder of how much we have to teach each other, not only about our own experiences, but about the ways in which we have a deeper understanding of our own experience from learning about somebody else's. So I want to thank you, Rebecca, for sharing your family's story, for teaching us this history, for challenging us to think about our own relationship to this history. It's really a brilliant book. And as you said, there's a section at the end with resources for exploring further, which is on your website. So we'll put that link in the chat. I want to share also some other resources from JWA that I think are relevant. One of the things I want to say, which we didn't talk about at all because it's not the subject of this book, but of course is really important, is that there are also Jewish Native people. And it's not that those two communities are always separate. So in March, I had the opportunity to speak with Jewish Native writer Emily Bowen Cohen about her wonderful graphic novel, Two Tribes, which is inspired by her own experience being Jewish, a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So you can watch that video. We also did an interview with the Jewish Native lawyer, Sarah Deer, whose activism changed policies to enable tribes to prosecute non-tribal members on reservations, which has been especially important in protecting women from violence. In your book, Rebecca, you talk a tiny bit about Felix Cohen, who worked on what was called the Indian New Deal during FDR's presidency, and his wife, Lucy Kramer Cohen, was his partner in a lot of that work and was a lifelong advocate for Native Americans. And we have a personal reminiscence about her written by a member of her family.
Oh, I want to read that. Neat.
Which is really cool. And in your book, you also talk about Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg's book on repentance and repair. And so anyone who's interested in more exploration of some of those ideas, I did a book talk with Danya when her book came out, so you can watch that as well.
Yes.
So always more to learn at JWA. Next week is the last book talk before we take a summer break. So please join us on Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Yael Azaguri and Fran Molino, who are the editors and translators of Mazel Tov, a novel by Blanche Ben-Dahan, which is a classic of North American Jewish fiction, which was recently translated into English for the first time. It's about North African Jewish women on the cusp of emancipation and decolonization. And the last thing I'll say is that here at JWA, we are approaching the end of our fiscal year on June 30th. And as I'm sure everyone knows, as a nonprofit, we rely on support from our community members to do our work. So if you've already donated to JWA, thank you so much. If you're able to contribute so we can continue to bring you programs like this one, we would of course be grateful for your support. And you can donate at jwa.org/donate. And that link is in the chat and also will be in our follow-up email tomorrow. And that's all for tonight, folks. So until next time, take care, stay out of the heat, enjoy the summer solstice. There's the last bit of light has left me here in Boston, but I know that Rebecca, you have a few more hours on your end of the country. Thank you so much, and good night, everyone, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for coming. Wonderful to be with you all. Thanks for your great questions. Take care.
Thank you, Rebecca.